Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. This week, we conclude our journey through the evolution of the vampire. It's been quite a journey these last few months. This vampire series has spanned 2 monarchs, several prime ministers, even more chancellors. I got married during this series. A lot of stuff has happened since we began our journey through the evolution of the vampire. So in this week's episode, we are simply going to be bringing the series to an end. We're going to be looking back at everything we've learned over the last 27 weeks on the series. Mary Wilde is going to be popping in for a quick chat, and then we're going to finish the episode by reading and responding to some audience feedback from the mailbag, and then counting down your top 10 vampire movies of all time. A big thank you to everybody who's written in with their feedback and their top 10s. We got hundreds and hundreds of responses, so we've collated all of the information and the feedback, and we'll be going through that later in the episode. So just a quick note to say that, as ever, this being the last episode of the series, we are now going to go on a little break, a bit of a hiatus for a few months. Season 9 of the podcast will begin in spring 2023. But don't forget, if you don't want to wait, if you want to continue getting weekly evolution of horror content, then you can. You just need to sign up to our Patreon channel, patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can sign up at $5 per month to get regular new episodes every month and a whole back catalogue of nearly 200 other bonus episodes. If you sign up this week at $5, you will get access to a special New Year's episode with Becky Dark and Stevie Webb, which is a hell of a lot of fun. We discuss Bloody New Year in depth. And then on the first week of January, I'll be assembling Team Fresh Blood. That's Brad Hanson, Becky Dark and Louise Blaine. And we'll be counting down our top 10 horror movies of 2022. So that is going to be a very fun discussion. Or you can sign up at a $10 level and get access to all of our mini seasons and get a brand new episode every single week. In January, we're going to be starting a brand new $10 mini season exploring the career of M. Night Shyamalan. So I'm going to be joined by different guests each week to discuss a load of his best and worst movies. We're going to revisit the high points of The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, the low points of Lady in the Water and The Happening, and some of the more recent bonkers stuff like Old and Glass, before we finish the mini-season by reviewing the brand new Shyamalan film, which is out in February. That's Knock at the Cabin. So that's just a little sample of the many things that we've got coming up over the next few months on Patreon. So if you want to continue getting EOH content on a regular basis, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's kick off the final episode of our vampire series by looking back at everything we've learnt over the last several months, and we conclude our journey through the evolution of the vampire.
The vampire film it so often seems like the very broadest subgenre within the already incredibly broad church of horror, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really fun genre. It's a genre that seems like it can be explored endlessly.
I love it when they're scary. I love it when they're sexy. I love it when they're frilly. I love it when they're sort of leathery.
The Vampire, one of cinema's oldest horror movie monsters, and it remains one of the most popular and prolific.
I'm flesh and blood, but not human. I haven't been human for 200 years.
We've just spent the last 27 weeks discussing vampire movies, and it still feels like we've barely scratched the surface when it comes to films, stories, and TV shows about these creatures of the night.
I can't believe you're still on vampires. It feels like months of our life that you've been watching vampire movies.
So what is it about vampires that inspires such a broad and diverse range of interesting and artistic works of fiction?
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
We all know what a vampire is from a very, very early age. It's one of the most instantly recognisable horror monsters.
The intrinsic attraction of vampires is something that you understand from a very young age. You understand the Count from Sesame Street. You know what a vampire is, and you know what the lore around Dracula is, and the idea of Dracula's castle sitting up on a hill, with lightning striking behind it is where the monsters live.
1 bet, 2 bets, 3 fabulous flyers!
And the vampire as a subgenre is quite simple. It doesn't really seem to have any parameters. A vampire movie is simply a movie that includes a vampire.
A vampire movie is a movie with a vampire in. So as a subgenre, there are many tropes that can go between the films, but it's not necessarily like, let's say, a zombie movie where there is like the text, and most texts are sort of responding to it.
Yes.
Vampire movies come in all shapes and sizes.
It's a subgenre that then has so many subgenres and subgenres, and I think it's, the monster of the vampire has just been utilised in so many disparate and interesting ways.
Every culture has a slightly different take on the vampire. We go on now, oh no, they can't walk around in daylight. Yeah, they can, because they could in some of the mythologies, and yeah, no, they can't change into wolves. Yes, they can, because in some of the mythologies they could do that as well, So the same basic part of the myth exists, this idea that they drink our blood, but the actual details have changed over and over and over and over again.
Unlike zombies or slasher killers, vampires have always had an air of respectability about them, probably due to their literary roots.
I mean, John Polidori's story, The Vampire, that came out in 1819. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. We had things like the Penny Dreadfuls, which were these cheap sort of, pulp magazines, pamphlets that were published, sort of for the masses. And, there was a character in that, a very popular character in a serial called Varney the Vampire.
But it was one particular work of fiction that would become arguably the most important and influential horror texts of all time. Bram Stoker's Dracula.
I am Dracula.
Dracula really is sort of year one, isn't it? This is where it comes into the mainstream.
I was really surprised by how horror-laden some of those moments are in that book. Like, I was like, wow,
yes.
this is proper horror.
Dracula created the rules for the vampire that we now all know. A handsome and sophisticated-looking being who feeds on other human beings to stay young and virile. A being that preys on its victims during the night, sleeps during the day, casts no reflection in the mirror, and is weakened by sunlight, garlic, or a crucifix.
It encapsulated everything that we think of now as the vampire, as this sort of, erudite aristocrat. I think the fangs come from Dracula. Fangs aren't really mentioned in the earlier stuff. The popular image of Dracula and vampires in general starts with that book.
Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Bram Stoker's Dracula would be arguably entirely responsible for the birth of the horror genre in cinema. After all, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, one of the first ever horror films, was an unofficial adaptation of Stoker's novel.
Yeah, I mean, essentially I think what happens with Nosferatu is it boils down all of the Victorian clutter of the novel to a very romantic essence. I say nothing remotely controversial when I state quite flatly, this is the very greatest of all silent horror films.
Then, less than a decade later, Todd Browning would design the templates for the classic monster movie with his adaptation of Dracula.
I am Dracula.
The moment I watched Dracula, it changed something, and it was the first Universal monster movie that I watched, and it opened up that world for me. That sense of Gothic, that sense of being transposed into a different world. None of this feels like real life. Everything is foggy and Transylvanian castles and faraway lands and weird customs and people with strange Hungarian accents and all that.
And there's something else about this story and this character that makes it stand out from other monsters. Dracula wasn't just scary, he was sexy.
He's erudite, he's learned, he had a library, he wants his library sorted out, he was so powerful, he's sexy, he's hypnotic, he's the perfect monster in so many ways.
Part of the vampire's popularity is its sex appeal.
Well, it's the horniest of the horror subgenres.
Yes!
I mean, that's absolutely what it is. It's the most obviously about sex of all the horror genres.
There is something indescribably alluring and appealing about being attacked by a vampire.
Yeah. Well, they are sexy. I mean, I was thinking about, when teenagers, what's the first thing you try to do when you're a teenager? You try and give someone a love bite.
Yeah, you try and bite their neck.
You do.
It's a monster of sex. Like, if the slasher is the sort of penetrative, punitive monster of sex, then vampires are the siren, the sort of the dangerous allure of sexuality rather than the vicious consequence.
Son of Dracula, searing the screen with new terror in this weird tale of the living dead who rise from the grave at night to prey on unsuspecting victims.
After Todd Browning's Dracula in 1931, vampire films, particularly Dracula films, dominated the horror genre for the next 10 to 20 years.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff.
By the time the Abbott and Costello Dracula movies rolled around in the mid-40s, the vampire had to take a short break.
And by the time that we get to Abbott and Costello Make Frankenstein, then it's become kind of, well, we're just going to make fun of this because we all know what the cliches are and they're just silly, and those are movies for kids now.
But it wouldn't be long before the vampire would return with added fangs and buckets of blood in the Hammer horror Christopher Lee Dracula movies.
Begins as it means to go on. There's the kind of a statement of intent in the very opening shot where you see the title is actually Dracula's name on a sarcophagus, onto which drips very, very red blood. So, I mean, right away, right from the very start, this is Hammer saying this is not like a Dracula film you've ever seen before.
Yeah. These days, it's easy for us to dismiss vampire movies as being one of the least scary subgenres. But for a generation of horror fans, Christopher Lee's portrayal of the Count in the Hammer Dracula series was one of the most terrifying performances in the history of the genre.
And the minute Christopher Lee comes down those steps and walks up to the camera, says, I am Dracula and welcome to my house and all the rest of it, and he's just like, that's it, you're just hooked. It's absolutely brilliant.
I am Dracula and I welcome you to my house.
But Hammer also explored new possibilities with the vampire. With some of their later Dracula movies, like Dracula AD 1972, they transported vampires and the Count to the modern day.
Hammer's last years, the early 70s, are actually one of the most exciting times for Hammer. Because they're forced to experiment and try new things.
Hammer also amped up the sexiness of their vampires in the 1970s. In 1971, they adapted Carmilla as The Vampire Lovers, the first mainstream vampire film to feature explicit lesbian sex.
The sleeping beauties whose troubled dreams turn into real, terrifying nightmares.
But of course, it introduces that interesting strand into vampirism of lesbianism, of same-sex desire.
Solidifying the vampire as not just the sexiest subgenre, but also the most overtly queer subgenre.
They're sexual, they're omnisexual. They are fuckboys, they are bimbos, they have sex with literally everyone. Nobody is only having sex with one gender, everybody's getting laid.
Going all the way back to the original Carmilla novel in the 19th century, queerness has always been front and center of the vampire subgenre.
And then the vampire itself is sort of a twisted version of normalcy. They have to hide and live in the shadows. They're considered by everybody around them to be these perverted, disease-riddled monsters who have to be destroyed. They live in secret. They always have a companion.
Yes.
Right. Oh, this is my secretary. Like, okay, sure.
And by the 1970s, with the relaxing of censorship around the world, filmmakers could make queerness not just subtext, but text in their vampire films.
I've seen many a night fall away into an even more endless night.
Nights like last night.
Who do you think I am? A kind of ghoul? A vampire?
Suddenly, anything was possible in vampire movies. Through the 1970s, British, American, and European filmmakers were using the vampire archetype to make bold, daring, and provocative works of art. From European art movies like Daughters of Darkness to American psychological horror films,
Paramount Pictures presents Let's Scare Jessica to Death,
to blaxploitation.
Dracula's soul brother.
What you see in a lot of these blaxploitation films is self-contained Black communities and Black achievement, right? So you're not thinking about the fact that the head forensic investigator is also Black.
Yeah.
And he's a boss over people who, white people who are under him, which is something, we can take for granted now. But trust me, in the 1970s, that is not something people were used to seeing.
For me, the 1970s was the most interesting and innovative decade for vampire cinema, with different filmmakers from around the world putting new and interesting spins on the monster.
My name is Martin. I'm 84 years old. People think I'm crazy when I tell them how old I am.
These are vampire films that have taken liberties with the mythology and done something absolutely amazing with them. In a lot of ways, I think there were more interesting vampire films made in the 70s at any other time. Much as I love my Hammer Draculas, they're my go-to films. But in terms of being interesting and challenging and experimental, it was the 70s. Again, as with so much in horror, the 70s is where all this sort of, let's tear up the rule book and start again was going on.
And 1979 was a benchmark year for the vampire, with Frank Langella's Dracula on the big screen.
He has walked through centuries, untouched by time.
Tobe Hooper's terrifying Salem's Lot on the small screen.
The floating Glick boys were a catalyst of generational trauma, weren't they? It's one of those images that has been welded into horror history.
And Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire dominating the indie and art house circuits.
I love the aura and the atmosphere of this film so much. It's such a strange delve into the mythos of Dracula, but also into the mind of Herzog and the kind of the different resonances that he gets from the story that no other director has got.
These three 1979 titles alone showed how varied and interesting the vampire subgenre had become through the 1970s. But at the turn of the decade, horror was beginning to change. Thanks to the slasher boom of the early 80s, horror cinema was now being aimed at younger audiences. And of course, vampires followed suit. By the mid-80s, teen vampire movies like Fright Night, Near Dark, and The Lost Boys had become hugely popular. Suddenly, vampire movies were less concerned with being transgressive or scary, and more interested in having sexy leading stars, awesome costumes, and banging soundtracks.
It's kind of impossibly cool, it's achingly cool. Especially at the time it came out, like with the soundtrack, with the fashion, the look of the movie, the kind of vampires as almost rock stars. They're almost like a kind of hair metal band.
This was a major turning point for the vampire subgenre.
My name is Merrick, and you have been chosen, Buffy.
Chosen to go to the graveyard. Why don't you just take the first runner-up, okay?
By the 1990s, the vampire had become the most mainstream of movie monsters, with directors like Francis Ford Coppola and Quentin Tarantino taking on vampire stories, and actors like Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, Keanu Reeves, and George Clooney starring in them.
Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Antonio Banderas, Kirsten Dunst, and Christian Slater. Interview with the Vampire.
Authors like Anne Rice had turned vampires into beautiful romantic leads, and Neil Jordan's film adaptation of Interview with the Vampire was a huge success and went on to gross over $200 million, something almost unheard of for a horror or monster movie.
I want some more.
For a certain generation of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, these were the vampire movies that we knew of. Interview with the Vampire, The Lost Boys, Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Can you at least tell me your name?
Angel.
Angel. It's a pretty name.
I think I came to vampire movies after falling in love with Buffy.
But I remember thinking, what a stupid title, and thinking it was really dumb and really silly. The first episode of Buffy I saw was the Halloween episode, and I was just absolutely hooked.
One of the things I found most surprising this series is how many of my guests said they weren't fans of the vampire subgenre. Stevie, what do you think of the vampire subgenre? Are you a fan?
Well, the straight answer is no.
Are you a fan of vampire films?
So, it's not one of the subgenres which I would gravitate towards.
Do you sort of gravitate towards vampire movies generally?
No, not really.
Would you say you're a fan of vampire movies?
Yeah, not really. And
are you a fan of this subgenre? And perhaps because for a certain generation of us horror fans who grew up in the 80s and 90s, vampires were a little too mainstream for horror, not edgy enough.
You know, horror at its heart is an outsider genre, and then all of the subgenres sort of play with different elements of that. And weirdly, I think that the populist version of vampirism is one of the least outsidery. Like the sort of the handsome, frilly cuffed, almost Heathcliffian like vampire character is a heartthrob in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And that feels anathema to pretty much any other horror antagonist.
Writers like Anne Rice and Joss Whedon had potentially softened the edges of the vampire. They no longer felt like monsters that belonged in the horror genre anymore. And by the time Stephenie Meyer introduced twinkling, sparkling vampires in Twilight, it was difficult to take the vampire seriously in mainstream American horror.
We do get a kind of vampire that owes a lot, I think, to kind of Anne Rice and the sort of brooding beauty of Brad Pitt in Interview with the Vampire, but through the eyes of a much younger target audience. So the monstrous aspect of vampires is almost, it is completely dulled. These aren't vampires that, look beautiful, but when you see them in their true form, they're actually hideous monsters. They're actually more beautiful in their true form in the sunlight.
In fact, by the 2010s, it felt like there was nowhere for the vampire to go except comedy.
Don't sing if you want to live long. They have no...
Awaken! Awakey, wakey!
You're dead, you're dead.
Twilight and True Blood and even Underworld, they're so earnest. There is such an earnest quality to them that this is like, okay, we need to let the air out of the tires a little bit and know that we can laugh at this and play with it.
Nando wants to kill Sean because he's got the brain scramblies.
Well, then Nando is correct. Have you gone soft, my sweet cider pie?
No, my sweet cider pie. I've gone hard because he's my best friend. He's my pal. He's my homeboy, my rotten soldier. He's my sweet cheese, my good time boy.
But outside of the mainstream over the last 30 years, indie and international filmmakers were still putting innovative spins on the vampire. In the 90s, Abel Ferrara and Larry Fessenden were making micro-budget art house movies about vampires that did something new, bold, and transgressive with the subgenre.
You think Nietzsche understood something? Mankind has striven to exist beyond good and evil from the beginning.
I mean, it's paying homage, I think, to things like Nosferatu, but I don't necessarily think that it's trying to
tap into all those other things that come along with the rules of vampires.
And in the 21st century, Jim Jarmusch, Anna Lily Amirpour, and Thomas Alfredson were just a few of the many interesting filmmakers making artistic and thought-provoking dramas about vampires that would explore notions of sex, relationships, friendship, aging, and death.
It's the idea is like, what do they live on blood, but also these characters need to live on culture and art and poetry and everything to keep them going. So it has all the tropes in there, but the theme at the heart of it is really looking at this thing of like, what is it that keeps you alive? What is it that keeps you interested and connected with the world around you?
But as beautiful and interesting as some of these art house vampires were, they didn't seem particularly concerned with unsettling or scaring us in the way that Hammer horror vampire movies of the 1960s did so well.
We've had the romantic ones. Yep, that's fine, that's great. I've no problem with them, let them have that. But I want the scary ones back again. You know, I want to be frightened by that thing lurking in the shadows, you know?
In a world post-Buffy and True Blood and Twilight, it's taken a long time for vampires to be taken seriously as scary horror monsters. But in the last couple of years, filmmakers like Mike Flanagan have taken vampires back to their terrifying, grotesque, and monstrous roots.
I screamed a couple of times. I mean, I cry at everything. I wept at many points. But there was a point at which somebody's like lapping up a sort of brain injury pool of blood where I found myself audibly going, yuck, which I don't know that I've ever done that in a TV show, an audible yuck.
At this point, it's hard to tell whether we're on the cusp of a scary vampire renaissance.
It'll take Ari Aster or someone to make a vampire film and suddenly they'll be cool again and they'll be scary again. Or, you know, if, you know, there's talk about Robert Egger remaking Nosferatu, isn't there? Now, if he does that, that could be the return of it. You know, if he does that straight, and I'm sure he will because he's too canny a director not to, if he does that as a proper horror story, that could be the return of the vampire to horror.
The vampire has had one of the most fascinating evolutions of all. From terrifying monsters dredged from our nightmares, to sexual icons, to rock stars, to twinkling romantic leads. And only time will tell what's in store for the vampire next. But one thing's for sure, there's no sign of this subgenre going anywhere. Cinema's oldest monster will remain the most enduring. It's not going to age or die, but instead remain young and sexy forever, constantly reinventing itself. And there we go. What a journey it's been. And on that note, I want to say a huge thank you one final time to every single guest who joined me this series. So a big thank you to Kevin Lyons, Kim Newman, Adam Robinson, James Swanton, Axel Carolyn, Graham Saunders, Tim Roby, Rosie Fletcher, Brad Hanson, Jen Handorf, Stacey Ponder, Dan Martin, Tanana Reeve-Dew, Stevie Webb, Louise Blaine, Jamie Graham, Joshua Tonks, Alex Ailing, Becky Dark, Chris Hewitt, Susan Kalman, James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi, James Rendell, Rob Watts, Tim Coleman, Steph McKenna, Michael Leader, Maha Al-Badrawi, Alex West, Rihanna Dillon, and Layla Latif. What an incredible guest list for this series. There have been some truly pinch me moments this year with some of the guests that I've managed to get on the podcast to discuss movies with, and I'm so grateful for every single brilliant guest, either new or returning, who join me to discuss vampires. But of course, there's one final thank you I've got to make to one particularly important guest, somebody who joined me throughout the series with her brilliant insights and her particular psychoanalytic approach to film analysis, and I have enjoyed her segments this series more than ever before. So, dropping in one final time this series to chat vampires with me, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast the amazing Mary Wild. Hello, Mary.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. I'm starting to feel festive this week, finally, which has been nice. What about you? Are you kind of in the festive spirit?
Yeah, I'm getting into the festive spirit for sure. Actually, I'm going to be working a lot this Christmas. I know it's a bit boring, but I've got lots of projects in the new year. I want to get a head start.
Amazing. This is very exciting, and probably nothing that you can talk about yet on mic, right, I guess? But it sounds like you've got some exciting things on the go.
Yeah, I do have some things that are pretty exciting. It's a little bit under wraps at the moment, but I will be announcing them soon.
Amazing. How exciting. Well, thank you for popping in for this quick little conclusion chat. And first of all, I just want to say, Mary, thank you so much for all of your incredible segments during this vampire series, because I have loved listening to every single one of them. And I think particularly this series with vampires, like I feel like your insights have been so important to this series and everything that we've been covering. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, as ever, for collaborating with me. Honestly, your podcast is a huge source of inspiration for me. It really structures my ideas, and it's nice to have the little mini deadlines across across your series. It keeps me off the streets.
That's right. Keeps you out of trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. How have you found it? What's it been like for you, this journey, kind of going through and revisiting all these vampire films?
I've really enjoyed it. I mean, vampires are really interesting to me, particularly as, they are so heavily sexually coded. And of course, as a Freudian, I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah.
But especially just also the fact that, vampires have big emo energy,
Yes.
They are the sad boys and sad girls of horror. And this is always fascinating to me. They have a strong melancholic energy to them. Mm-hmm. And so it just immediately renders them very psychological. So they're very interesting to study.
What has been kind of your favorite one to kind of go back and discuss and kind of explore this series, would you say?
I mean, this took me by surprise, actually. I didn't think it was going to be this title that really kind of inspired me and made me want to dig deeper, but actually it was the Twilight Saga that
I knew it.
I am a fan, as I said on my segment. I have I regard it with affection, but when prior to starting researching it and writing about it, I didn't think I'd have so much to say, and it kind of made me think that it has its place as a dominant force in pop culture for a reason. It really made me free associate a lot and wonder more about this strange, this strange fairy tale, which is kind of bonkers and very, very camp. So actually, I really had fun writing that one.
Honestly, I don't know if you found this. I think you did, because so many people, I think, were writing in to say how much they enjoyed your perspective on Twilight. And Twilight is the one that I've received the most amount of correspondence about and I wasn't expecting that at all. But I think it's just one of those franchises that people are kind of fascinated by it, aren't they? Whether they love it or they hate it. I think everyone kind of has an opinion on it. And I think it's been really fun to kind of explore that with the listeners as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not surprised that you get very impassioned views on both sides of the argument, that it might be very divisive and people have divergent opinions, but they still feel compelled to express their thoughts. And that's a sign of a good film or franchise, I feel, if it gets under your skin.
Yeah, I completely agree. The worst thing is to have something that everyone can just be sort of indifferent towards, right? And Twilight is definitely not that. There's no indifference in either way.
No.
That's very cool. And I think, one thing I sort of noticed when listening to your segments particularly as well is just how varied the vampire genre is too. Your segments have gone from being very sexual to being very fun and playful to being quite serious and political at times as well, right? And I think that's been a really lovely thing to kind of explore during these films,
Yeah, you're right. There is a huge range of possibilities within the vampire subgenre. There's room for a lot of like different tones and, just different expressions artistically and things that people want to convey. Like the filmmakers want to convey a message, and the vampire trope is so kind of like versatile for, actually communicating a very diverse range of ideas. You mentioned obviously the fun bit is Twilight. All the sexy stuff, is I think very prevalent. I thought especially in The Lost Boys,
Yes, definitely. Lost Boys is a very sexy film. Obviously, I mean, Daughters of Darkness is a real, that has been such a highlight for me in terms of the movies. I absolutely adore that film. It's so
Me
good.
too. It is gorgeous. It is so beautiful to look at. And I feel like it's timeless.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
It kind of captured the kind of timelessness of the vampire itself. Like, it just doesn't age. I feel like it looks modern. If it were just to be released today, it would look chic and relatable and like, elegant even today. And, you also mentioned the political dimension. Obviously, I touched on that with, Anna Lily Amirpour's film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night.
Yes, yeah.
And another great way for the vampire thought experiment as, something undead that prowls the streets at night, and kind of stalks its victims and like really surveils them, actually. How this has the potential to be used as a political metaphor. And so it really is like a credit to the trope itself and the subgenre itself that is able to be picked up by a multitude of different perspectives and communicate something really important and interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And I think what I've come to realize as well whilst doing this series is that while most subgenres kind of have these kind of set tropes and parameters, like, we kind of all sort of know how a zombie movie plays out or a slasher movie, but a vampire movie just has a vampire in it, right? But other than that, it could kind of be anything. It can be romantic, it can be scary, it can be, period set, it could be very modern, it could be sci-fi. There are almost no other kind of restrictions on the format other than having vampires in them, right? So I think that's been really interesting to look at.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Dr. Sleep is a great example of that. Like how, you can pick up this idea and like actually like really push the envelope as to what a vampire can really be and extend the definition of that and push the limits of that definition. For me, ultimately it is about draining energy, like pulling the life force out of something because the subject, the undead vampire itself is lacking and feels like a void or a chasm inside that needs to be like refilled. And really, they are just, they have the ability to witness a vast stretch of history being undead. But this also means that they're sort of always living in the past and ruminating. Like they're unable to progress. They're not able to move on, which has a very kind of depressive quality about it. And people who are kind of stunted psychologically and, it's actually a sad situation. So this can be employed in a multitude of different ways cinematically.
So true. And actually, I did think that was really fun that you, in your Dr. Sleep observations, and you talked about energy vampires, you made that connection to people like Colin Robinson, right? From What We Do in the Shadow, which is so true. It's something really interesting and real about that, right? About kind of energy suckers, I suppose,
Yeah, energy suckers, exactly. Like, I feel like maybe, with the new year approaching, I feel like all of us should go and make sure that we have the self-awareness to never be that energy drainer,
Yes.
It's difficult coming out of a pandemic because it's nice to be able to, reunite with other people and like share everything and like, be commune together again.
Yeah.
But there is an art to relating to others and conversing, and it's give and take. And I feel like with the energy vampire, it's someone who's just like dominating in what it's supposed to be a dialogue. They're, they're overstepping their boundaries. And this can be as mild and comedic as what we've seen in What We Do in the Shadows,
Yeah. I love it. And yeah, I think there is that really, one of the things I found really interesting that I wasn't expecting is talking to all my guests each week about their thoughts on the subgenre. I kind of assumed everyone loved vampire films, but actually not that many people did. And I wonder if that's because, do you think it's become kind of too mainstream in the last few decades with movies like Twilight or Interview with the Vampire or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I think that might be a cause for that. It's definitely a factor where it's taking horror too much out of its appealing fringe status and into the mainstream. And yes, for sure, vampires are the leading cause of that, especially with like True Blood and all of these super popular vampire TV shows. Yeah. So yeah, and I understand that. There's a certain appeal and mystique to horror being a bit alternative and too hard to be appreciated by normies. I totally get that. But I guess, maybe what makes me immune to that opinion is that I just find vampires aesthetically so pleasing. I want their wardrobe. I want their hair.
I know, amazing. And actually, there's a really interesting observation that one of my listeners pointed out in an email, which I'm going to read later in this episode. But they talked about how, is this maybe in connection to the fact that vampires are the most sexy, beautiful monsters in horror? The films themselves have been so beautiful. I struggle to think of another subgenre where we have films with production design and cinematography as beautiful as films like Only Lovers Left Alive or Interview with the Vampire, whatever, Daughters of Darkness. These films are all just kind of sumptuous and lush, aren't they, as well?
They're visually luxurious, you just want to continue watching. They're so appealing and sensual. Yeah. And maybe another reason why, people find vampires a bit, I don't know, unappealing as a trope is that they are just such loners and the weirdos in the shadow. They're not the people that will it's not the kind of horror where people are just going crazy, in a kind of, a slasher style of going berserk. There's something much more tragic about them. And they sort of I guess they just have a psychological baggage of sadness, which maybe brings down the fun factor in horror a little bit so that it's too confronting maybe psychologically. I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I don't know. And I'm really interested to see, I guess, to kind of round up on this topic of vampires is kind of what the future is. Because, last week we discussed these kind of Mike Flanagan films, Midnight Mass and Doctor Sleep, that feel a bit like they are starting to take vampires a little bit more seriously again now. After Twilight and after What We Do in the Shadows, it felt like, vampires almost couldn't be taken seriously in horror for a while at least. And now, I don't know, do you think we're starting to get back to that place? Do you think that vampires can ever be kind of frightening horror monsters again?
Yes, I do. But it's going to have to take a very conscious, deliberate effort to achieve that, because there's a lot of baggage that needs to be released. Just because of those titles that you mentioned that made vampires so ubiquitous and just everywhere, and almost like a soap opera, it has to almost evolve out of the soap opera and become something sinister again, but this all has to be reimagined. And there has to be something almost really stripped down, almost the way that we see in The Addiction.
Yeah.
It has to be something really radical that's very maybe even transgressive in some way, or maybe even taboo. But whatever it is, it has to be stripped down, tone down the soap opera stuff, just completely eliminate that and make it believably scary again. And then maybe it'll have its moment again in the cycle of being truly embraced by all of the horror community.
Yeah, you're so right. And it's true. Vampires do lend themselves to soap opera. I mean, it goes back to, I know one of your favorites is Dark Shadows, right, as well. But
yes.
there is something in connection with vampires and kind of soap opera type narratives, isn't there? I think, again, it's that heavy kind of emotional side to them, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, it is, I feel why Dark Shadows actually, does the miraculous thing of literally being a soap opera and yet making the mystique of vampires be very cool and interesting. Just because everyone looks amazing. And the cinematography is top notch. Even though it was for TV, it's good enough to screen in a cinema. It's gorgeous. But also, like, there's something deeply disturbing going on in Dark Shadows, which very tragically Tim Burton picked up and made into a movie with Johnny Depp, and it was awful. It was a travesty. Like that should be a war crime. What happened to Dark Shadows? So I just it takes a certain balance, and maybe it can still capture some of the kind of soap opera, like a little bit melodramatic aspect, but just make it stripped down, cool, not playing for jokes, but actually tap into something taboo, sinister, and transgressive again.
I can't wait. And I can't wait to, and I'm not going to reveal too much, and we won't talk too much yet about my next series. But obviously, Mary, I would love to have you back for the next series, because I think that also next series we're going to be covering something significantly darker and more disturbing in terms of the subject matter than what we've done this year with vampires, So that's going to be fun.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. And thank you for bringing me back. I'm so excited to do another round of Wild About Horror segments for Evolution of Horror. I have to say, your listeners are the coolest people. Like the DMs that I get and the feedback that I get is so nice, and it's just like, it just really propels me forward.
They've honestly, like, I get so much on a weekly basis, lovely correspondence about you and your segment, and for so many people they're the highlights of the episodes. But it's been so much fun to hear your segments this series. Also, FYI, people love your voice, Mary, and you've gone more like ASMR with some of these segments, which I love. Was that deliberate?
Yes, I have to say. I mean, maybe it was only like semi-deliberate in the sense that I listen to a lot of ASMR content. I think it's just rubbed off, I'm like unconsciously appropriating ASMR. But that's very nice to hear. Very flattering. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, we will reunite at the beginning of next series, as we always do, and then we'll get, more Brilliant World About Horror segments. So thank you. And in the meantime, Mary, just let people know, while we're on our hiatus, where can people kind of come and find more of your content and more of your work out there online?
Yeah, sure. So you can follow me at PsychStar, PSYCSTAR on Twitter and Instagram. You can also obviously catch up on my shows that I do with Sarah Cleaver on Projections Podcast. I also post exclusive content on Patreon, where you can find me as patreon.com/MaryWild. Also, just a final thing to mention, I'm going to be making my debut at the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies.
Wow.
Yeah, teaching a course on feminine jouissance in horror cinema, and that's going to be happening live in London in February on Valentine's Day.
Oh, perfect. That's incredible. Congratulations. That's so cool.
Thank you so much.
Amazing. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining me, and Merry Christmas.
And you too, have a very happy Christmas and brilliant New Year.
A big thank you to the brilliant Mary Wild, and one more time a huge thank you to her for her brilliant contributions this series, and I already cannot wait to hear what she's going to bring to next series. So we're going to finish this week's conclusion episode by reading and responding to some audience feedback, and then after that we will count down the listeners' top 10 vampire movies. So let's kick things off with some mailbag emails. Now, so many of you wrote in this series, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who emails me. And I'm so sorry I don't always get a chance to reply to everyone, but please do know that I read every single email that comes in, whether I'm able to reply or not. I do always read every email that comes to me, and I appreciate every bit of feedback, positive or negative, that I get from you guys, because you're all super smart and awesome, and I love hearing from you. So please never stop emailing me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, with your thoughts and feedback. But I've picked a handful of emails that I'm going to read and respond to. So this first email comes from Craig Matthews. Craig says, "Hi Mike, this was the first series I followed along week by week, and I really enjoyed it. It was interesting to hear new perspectives on films I loved already, as well as discovering new favourites, especially Daughters of Darkness and Martin. It was a nice change of pace, covering Bram Stoker's novel as well. I'm particularly pleased you covered Thirst. It's one that's always stood out to me in the subgenre, and it made a great pairing with Let the Right One In. I watched the Twilight films for the first time as part of this series, and honestly, I didn't hate them, even if they generally weren't that good. People making hating things teenage girls like such a big part of their personality is tiring, and they absolutely deserve to be covered as part of the series for the cultural impact alone. I'm personally not a fan of The Human Centipede 2 or some of Eli Roth's work, but I wouldn't argue that they shouldn't have been included in the Mind and Body series because of it. Thank you so much for that lovely email, Craig. And Craig is one of many people who wrote to me referring to our Twilight episode and responding to some of the negative feedback that I got about covering Twilight. So just to give everyone some context, during our Twilight episode with Steph McKenna, I briefly mentioned that I had received a couple of emails from people, angry emails from listeners that were actually quite upset that I was covering Twilight. I mentioned this in passing, and honestly, it wasn't many emails. I think I got 2 emails with people that were angry about me covering Twilight. And since then, I've had hundreds, I'm not kidding, hundreds of emails from people saying how grateful they were that we did cover Twilight and how that person who was negative was completely wrong to be so negative. So thank you so much to everyone. You know, like I didn't actually mean to make a big deal out of that a couple of people had been angry at me, but you all flooded in with such lovely responses to that that it was really, really wonderful to read. And again, this is something I wasn't expecting, but Twilight became not only one of our most downloaded episodes of our vampire series, but also the episode that prompted the most amount of feedback, mainly positive feedback as well. So I absolutely love that, and I love you all for sending in your emails about the Twilight episode. And Craig, I'm so happy to be able to introduce you to such gems as Daughters of Darkness and Martin, 2 of my personal favourite vampire movies. And we'll see when we get to the top 10, but I was absolutely delighted in how many people gave Daughters of Darkness some love, especially people that had only just discovered it for the first time. So thank you for that lovely email, Craig. This email came from Joe. Joe says, "Hi Mike, this is my first time emailing, but I just wanted to drop you a line to say I've been really enjoying the Vampire series. You covered a surprising number of my all-time favourite movies, from Blade to Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I was very excited to see Near Dark being featured, as I feel it's underrated. The reason for my email is due to another underrated film that I feel should have been on your list, and that's Neil Jordan's Byzantium. It's in my top 10 favourite films of all time, and I always try to advocate for it. It's a low-key, moody, female-led horror movie that did something really interesting with the vampire lore and features an amazing central performance from Saoirse Ronan. There's also a sort of cloying sense of horror and decay that should be familiar to anyone who grew up in a provincial British seaside town. It's such an interesting contrast with Interview with the Vampire that it's hard to believe it's from the same director. I'm writing this before the Also Rans episode, so I can still hold out hope for a mention on there. As a final thought, if it's okay for you to cover Independence Day in the Alien series, then it's more than fine for you to cover Twilight. I'm not a fan myself, but I think people are forgetting that the podcast is called The Evolution of Horror, so why not cover it? Keep up the good work and don't listen to the haters." There we go, another little mention of Twilight there. Thank you so much, Joe, for that lovely email. And yes, you know, Byzantium, we did mention it briefly in the Also Rans, and I know that me and Brad said that we weren't massive fans of the film. I had only seen it once. I think Brad has only seen it once, and it didn't really strike a chord with me. But you are one of many, many, many people who emailed me saying that I need to give Byzantium another go, and I definitely will, because I've been wrong many times before. I've already said that I watched Only Lovers Left Alive for the first time, and I hated it. I rewatched it for the Vampire series, and I loved it. The same with Park Chan-wook's Thirst. I didn't like that the first time I saw it. Everyone encouraged me to rewatch it for the Vampire series, and I was like, what am I talking about? This film is brilliant. So maybe I'm going to do the same thing with Byzantium, because my memories of Byzantium were that it had some great performances and some quite chilling, eerie cinematography. Like you say, that kind of moody British seaside vibe. But I remember the story kind of lacking for me, and it felt a bit predictable and it felt a bit plodding. And I just don't remember it gripping me in the way that I wanted it to. However, I am definitely the sort of person that needs to watch a film twice often to fully appreciate it. So I promise you, Joe, I am going to make it my mission to give it a second watch this year. And if I do enjoy it, maybe we can find time to cover it on Patreon as like a bonus vampire episode later on in the year. Okay, thank you for that lovely email, Joe. This email comes from Max. Max says, "Hi Mike, just a quick note to say that while I definitely checked out of the series a while back, it wasn't due to any format related stuff. For me, there is just something about vampires and vampire films that I don't find at all interesting. So just the worst subject fit of all the series so far when it comes to horror. Love the show and all your guests so much. I always look forward to, in particular, Fresh Blood. And one suggestion, if you were ever looking to do a joint episode, would be to do one with the Dead Meat podcast duo. Your two shows are my favourites." Thank you, Max, for that lovely email. That's really funny. I have actually received a couple of emails from people along similar lines. Let me read this email from John. John says, "Hi Mike, love your show. The podcast is always the highlight of my week, even when you cover a subgenre that I hate, like vampires. Yes, I've got to admit, in terms of the films, this has been my least favourite series so far. For whatever reason, vampires have never really done anything for me. However, while I haven't bothered rewatching the films like I do with most seasons, I've really enjoyed listening to the discussions every week. And I've got to admit that I feel a pang of satisfaction and vindication every time one of your guests said that they don't like vampire films. Anyway, keep up the great work, and I'm very excited for the next season, as some of these will be my very favourite movies." Thank you, John, and thank you, Max. You know, I get it. Both of you guys emailed to say that you really don't like vampire films. One of you carried on listening, the other one didn't. That's totally fine. Max, by the sounds of it, you're still subscribed to Patreon, so that's fine by me. No, but honestly, I absolutely get it. Not every subgenre is for everyone, and that's the risk I take with my podcast, because if you don't like a certain subgenre, it means that I could potentially lose you as a listener for like a whole year, right? And that's the risk. But I'm so grateful to everyone who does listen, even if they don't necessarily love the films. And I hope that even if the films aren't always to your taste, that the discussions can still be interesting and entertaining. So thank you very much for that feedback. This email comes from Belle Morrigan. Belle said, "Hi Mike, just finished listening to Let the Right One In episode, and there was just a brief moment I wanted to call attention to. When you mentioned the queer subtext, which I personally believe is strongly present without knowing the backstory of the book, it was quickly shut down by you and your guest as a story about pre-sexual love. I personally don't think there was any ill intent with this comment, but it is a prime example of the societal misconception that there are no queer children and that queer attraction is only related to sex. I just wanted to email, as I believe this should be addressed in a future episode. Your podcast is fantastic and you've created such a vibrant community around the show. Excited to listen to future episodes, and if you're ever seeking a guest for a queer horror film, it would be a dream come true." Thank you so much, Belle, for that lovely feedback. I did reply to you, and I know that we sort of chatted together, but you're absolutely right. Like, everything you said there is correct, and I kind of realised it as soon as that episode went out, and as soon as I had made that comment, I sort of thought that was wrong. And I told you this in an email, but, you know, I agree with you. Everything you said there about, you know, me and my guest kind of dismissing the idea that this boy could be queer because he was prepubescent and that maybe he was too young to know what he was. That's just wrong. That's just a wrong observation, really. And it does add to that societal misconception that there are no queer children and that queer attraction is only related to sex, which isn't the case. So I completely agree with everything you said there, Belle, and I do apologise for that error. Sometimes this is the problem with podcasts. They are off-the-cuff conversations, and sometimes you can say things wrong. Obviously, no offence intended there with that comment, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. And Belle, I would absolutely love to collaborate with you on a podcast in the future. I know that you yourself, Belle, has a great podcast called Fishnets and Philosophy, which I've actually listened to a couple of episodes of, and it's excellent, and I would love for us to work together at some point in the future. So thank you so much, Belle, for that lovely email. This email comes from Saw Tun. Hello, Saw. He says, "Hi, Mike. Mega thanks to you and all your esteemed guests, as per usual, for the latest season. Vampires are my least favourite genre in horror, but this season of EOH has been one of your strongest yet. I sometimes find that Team EOH is at its best when it's covering some of the less favourable sequels and franchises, but those episodes are the ones I love listening to. Films I'd never watch, but you and your gang take one for the team, like when you covered all of Hellraiser, and this time round, the Twilight Saga. It's not an unusual occurrence to hear you, Becky, Brad, Louise, Rob, Stevie, etc. in my car and through Alexa at home, and I'm a forever fan of all the bants and laughter keeping me sane. Thank you so much and look forward to the next season." Oh, thank you so much, Saw. That's a lovely message, and love that. I love that idea that even though it's your least favourite subgenre, it's been one of your favourite seasons, and that's true. I mean, some people do love it when we cover bad films or films we don't like on this podcast. And again, it all just comes down to taste. I know that some people get really upset if I'm negative about a film they love. Other people love it when we're negative about films. So I'm glad that there is something for everyone. This email comes from Jonathan. Jonathan says, "Hi Mike, I've been occasionally joining my wife as she watches your entire vampire movie series with you, and we just watched Only Lovers Left Alive for the first time. I deeply disliked this movie, but it had a few redeeming qualities. I disliked it so much because of the childish fantasy of being a tortured artist. I thought Adam was a caricature of every 21-year-old guitarist's vision for caring only about art and not the fame, and having to run away to his analog instruments in a secluded place and bang his hot wife. Lastly, I disliked the director's shoehorning in of all of his favourite artists. I, for one, find it impossible to believe that a 1,000-year-old vampire would listen to Jack White. I think that the director was trying to elevate his own musical interests to the level of an ancient godlike musician. I thought the actors did an incredible job and the movie was pretty, but other than that, I found it immature and hokey." Well, Jonathan, I don't disagree with what you said there in some ways. I mean, I think some of what you said is a bit strong, but I will say that the first time I watched Only Lovers Left Alive, I had a very similar reaction. I talked about this on the episode, but when I first watched it, I found it insufferable and pretentious and up its own arse, to be quite frank. And basically, a lot of the stuff that you described there was sort of how I felt the first time I watched it. It just kind of felt painfully hipster. And when I watched it again, I kind of felt completely different about it. So I would urge you, Jonathan, maybe give it a bit of time. Have a bit of time away from Only Lovers Left Alive, and then go back to it, because I think you might find, if you're anything like me, that the film is more of a grower than a shower, because I actually really loved giving it another watch for the series and then discussing it on the podcast. But thank you for the review. This email comes from lovely Trina. Trina says, "Hi Mike, I had the most fun listening to this vampire season since Zombies, and it wouldn't be an evolution of horror season if I didn't discover new treats to add to my endless list of horror favourites. Daughters of Darkness and Twins of Evil are both highlights. It was great being given a nudge to revisit so many classics that I hadn't seen in years, including, of course, Nosferatu and the Bela Lugosi Dracula. My favourite episode so far has been the Twilight one, which was highly entertaining as always and made me laugh out loud most of the way through. Since the original release of the first movie, I've made a conscious and deliberate decision to avoid them all like the plague. After listening to you and Steph describing the pain of watching the entire franchise back to back, I feel like my decision has been a positive life choice. I'll be forever grateful to you both for enduring your ordeal so I don't have to. Thank you, as always, to you and your wonderful guests for consistently giving us such informative, fun and entertaining quality content week after week. My life would be so much duller without EOH and its brilliant community." Oh, thank you. That's what a lovely thing to read. Thank you so much, Trina. That's such lovely feedback, and I'm so grateful for you and all of the support that you give the podcast. It really means a lot. This email comes from Andy Higgs, and Andy talks about a few of the movies that we didn't cover this series. So Andy says, "Hi Mike, thanks for another great series. Really enjoyed this one, as I've always been a fan of the toothsome and gruesome fanged fellas. It feels wrong moaning about not covering every example, but you did ask on the socials, so here's a few which I would have loved to have been featured. Firstly, Roman Polanski's 1967 spoof/homage to the world of gothic horror, The Fearless Vampire Killers, also known as Dance of the Vampires. It has sumptuous period production design, which is far more lavish than the Hammer and the Universal films, which it spoofed. The comedy is a little uneven, but it has one of the greatest vampire mirror sequences and a very effective attack on a bathing Sharon Tate. My other retro pick would be the 1970 Czech folk horror Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. This stunning dreamlike fairy tale is a much overlooked piece of fairy tale terror, combining a sexual awakening narrative and a distinct anti-church tone. It's not a film to watch for a coherent plot, but as a vampire-tinged, surreal and Freudian Alice in Wonderland, it's well worth experiencing, and I would love to have heard Mary Wilde's thoughts. And this leads me nicely to my final mention, that is Byzantium, Neil Jordan's underappreciated 2012 return to the vampire genre following his Rice adaptation. Gemma Arterton and Saoirse Ronan star as mother and daughter vampires on the run in bleak seaside resorts from a ruthless brotherhood of vampires, set over a 200-year period with a neo-noir style in its present-day sequences and a painterly pre-Raphaelite or romantic tone in its historic flashbacks. I'd argue it's superior to Interview with the Vampire, and if nothing else, has one of the most unique methods of transformation into the undead. Anyway, thanks for such a great show, and in particular this awesome season, plus a special thanks to the fantastic community which has grown from it on the socials." Thank you so much to Andy Higgs for that lovely email and those brilliant reviews. I mean, there was almost no point in me covering these movies when you could write such lovely erudite reviews of those films, Andy. But yes, I will absolutely be sure to check some of these movies. Some of them will be rewatches, some of them will be first-time watches for me, but they all need watching at some point this year. So thank you so much for that feedback. This email comes from Melanie Hamilton. Melanie says, "Hi Mike, I am a huge fan of the pod. I also love that all of my favourite podcasters, Faculty of Horror and Gaylords of Darkness, are friends with each other, and I love it when you all do crossovers. If I could come up with a clever name for all of you similar to the MCU, I would." Just as an aside here from Mike, I think we need to come up with that. What's a good name for like a MCU style collective of all of these horror podcasters? We need a big collective name. Anyway, I'm going back to Melanie's email now. Anyway, I have loved this series, and it really made me realise that I am more of a fan of vampire TV than vampire movies. Buffy and What We Do in the Shadows are two of my favourite TV shows of all time, and I absolutely loved Midnight Mass, and I was excited to hear you guys were covering it. Watching Midnight Mass was interesting because I am no longer a churchgoer, but I went to Catholic school all my life, and it hit all those nostalgia notes, good and bad. Can't wait to see what genre you'll do next. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that lovely email. I am in complete agreement with you about everything you said there. This is one of the things that I realised when I was collating my top 10 vampire movies. I prefer vampire TV shows to films, particularly those three you mentioned. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, What We Do in the Shadows, which I watched for the first time this year and adored, and Midnight Mass. They would probably be my top 3 vampire techs if I was to include them, but because they're vampire TV shows, I didn't include them in my list. But I think you're right there. I agree with you. I think that maybe vampire TV shows are more my bag than vampire films. Okay, let's go on to this next email from Summer. Summer says, "Hello Mike, this is my second time writing in. The first time was last year for the Alien recap, and that was definitely a recap. This email is more of a thank you. Let me explain. I found your podcast right before the pandemic hit, when my current obsession was The Invisible Man, so I had an incredible catalogue to explore during the lockdown. But then something else and very new happened to me towards the end of 2020. I got sober. I was 2 years sober on December 12th. If you do the math, that means I started my recovery journey during your mind and body season. Very fitting. They say the first year is the hardest, and that it was. But again, your podcast oddly fit what I was going through. Being an alien, feeling out of place, but also calibrating my own cosmic connection to the universe while learning to be human again. And so why am I telling you this during the vampire recap? Because I've been preparing to move across the country to Los Angeles this year. I don't know about you, but I've always thought of LA as the vampire capital of the States, or even the world. Figuratively speaking, that is. I made a 5-year plan in 2019, and I like to think that my sobriety knocked a couple of years off that plan, because I am now writing this email to you from my Los Angeles apartment. I'd also like to point out that as a gay man who has always identified with vampires and think vampires are queer as fuck, thank you for not shying away from that. In a weird way, you help me and people like me more than you'll ever know. Thank you for all you do, and happy holidays. Oh, thank you, Summer. What an amazing email. Thank you so much for telling me all of that, and congratulations on being 2 years sober. That is absolutely incredible. And moving to LA, like, what an exciting year it sounds like you've had. Thank you so much for that really lovely, very moving email. It means a lot to hear that, and congratulations again, and please do keep in touch for the next series. This email comes from Thomas DeFlora. Thomas says, "Hello Mike, great series as usual. Sorry, but I'm a bit of a cheerleader for this US television movie from 1971, The Night Stalker, possibly the first vampire as noir crime procedural, with a silent brutal vamp as a serial killer. No suave charmer here, just cruel indifference driven by bloodlust. Had a major effect on 11-year-old me. Deserves to be seen and maybe remade. Love the pod, and thanks again, Tom." Thank you, Tom. Now, I read this email because I had so many other emails similar to this one with people recommending The Night Stalker, and a big apologies to everyone that it didn't get a single mention on the series, because by the sounds of it, I think maybe more for US listeners than UK listeners, but for a lot of you it sounded like The Night Stalker was made a big impact on you. So this is, as Thomas said, a kind of TV movie from 1971. I haven't seen it. I wasn't even aware of it until everyone started writing in about it. So I promise I will make a point to see it this year. And again, it will get covered on Patreon if I'm able to see it and if I think it's worth a discussion, which by the sounds of it, it definitely is. So thank you so much, Thomas, for that feedback. Okay, I'll just read a couple more emails. This one comes from Glenn. Glenn says, "I want to start off by saying a huge thank you for this podcast. It's fantastic and for sure one of my favourites. Listening to your friendly, bright and very often light-hearted voice talk about and dissect some of the most harrowing and gory and suspenseful horror films is a rare treat. I am currently listening to your vampire series and it's amazing. You've already mentioned some of my very favourites. Your What We Do in the Shadows episode was by far the best. And I also think your guests bring such great and crucial perspectives on all the films and series discussed. I am only a bit surprised that there was no mention of the series Penny Dreadful, Eva Green, Josh Hartnett and Timothy Dalton. I'm a bit biased as this is one of my all-time favourite series, but I would have been truly so interested in what you thought of it. I'm of course not sure if you have ever given it a watch, but Dracula and a host of other vampires are in it, and the performances, particularly by Green, are phenomenal. And there was no mention of it in your Also Rans episode. I figured I would mention it to you, and maybe one of these days you might find an opportunity to give this masterpiece a mention. Thank you, Glenn, for that lovely email. Now, as it happens, I did watch Penny Dreadful. At least I watched the first season, and you're not going to like this, Glenn. I didn't really like it, and I thought I was going to love it. On paper, this was going to tick all my boxes, this kind of really cool serialized drama, period set that featured an array of classic horror movie monsters and sort of tied them all together in kind of Victorian London. I thought this was going to be awesome. For me, it just didn't quite hit the mark. I didn't think that the writing was as good as I wanted it to be. I didn't love the way it looked. It had this kind of mix of being quite glossy whilst also looking a bit cheap, personally, for me. Am I being a bit harsh on that? Maybe I need to give it another chance. I've already said a bunch of times this week how often I'm wrong first time and I need to give things another chance. But I tried it. I watched the whole of the first season, and then I think I got to season 2 and I gave up after about 2 episodes in because I thought, no, I'm done with this. It's not doing anything for me. So it didn't work for me personally, but I know that you and a bunch of other listeners are fans of Penny Dreadful. And it is really difficult, I've got to say, covering television on the podcast. Like, I've done it a handful of times with TV shows that I feel are genuinely hugely important and that can't really be avoided. So, for example, Doctor Who and The X-Files last season and Buffy the Vampire Slayer this season. I would argue that they are important and crucial texts that you cannot avoid talking about when it comes to the evolutions of these genres, right? But for me, Penny Dreadful and even True Blood, which I know a load of you asked me to cover, they are not as crucial to the evolution of the subgenre. And on top of that, they're very, 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 very long. It's a lot of hours. And sadly, I just don't have enough hours in my week to rewatch and then discuss them. I did this with X-Files last year for the Alien series, and it nearly killed me because I had to binge watch about 50 hours worth of stuff just for one single episode. And as fun as that was, I just can't do that over and over again, sadly. So for TV shows that I'm not familiar with, or TV shows that don't actually add anything new to the subgenre, I'm just not able to cover, really, most of the time. But I get that people were disappointed that we weren't able to cover shows like Penny Dreadful and True Blood, so apologies for that. Again, I will refer you onto other great podcasts out there. I'm pretty sure the Final Girls did an episode on True Blood in their vampire series, so definitely go and check that one out. This email comes from Vincent Gain. Vincent says, "Greetings, Mike, you bloody genius. This series was fantastic. As you and your esteemed guests pointed out, the vampire is rarely a frightening monster, which allows for it to be used in more sympathetic ways. The different portrayals explored in this season have included the outsider, the liminal, the teenager, the misunderstood, sometimes the underrepresented, such as queer, women, and people of colour, and they were all treated to fascinating and erudite discussions. Also, perhaps because vampires have a tendency to be beautiful, many of the films discussed on this season have themselves been utterly gorgeous to look upon. From the sumptuousness of Interview with the Vampire to the stark visuals of The Addiction, this has been one of the best looking seasons of films in the history of the podcast. Thank you for all you do. You've made us, in a sense, your own blood pack." Thank you, Vincent, for that lovely email. It's a really good point, actually. That's something that I hadn't even really considered, but you're absolutely right. I would say that it complements the monster itself in that most of the films we've discussed this series have been beautiful to look at, whether it's German Expressionism with Nosferatu or the examples you mentioned there, like Interview with the Vampire and The Addiction. Only Lovers Left Alive just kind of oozes style. So does Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. You're absolutely right. These films all look stunning. That was something that hadn't really occurred to me before, but that's a really, really good observation. Thank you, Vincent, for that email. One final email from Sarah, and this is a nice little segue that's going to lead us into our top 10 rankings. Sarah says, "Hello, Mike. I don't know if it's just me, but the vampire subgenre has been among the hardest to rank. Other subgenres have been hard because there are so many contenders for my top 10, ghosts and the occult especially, and it was so hard to choose the order once I got it down to 10. But with vampires, I'm having trouble with the vast tonal split among my favourites. These are wildly different films, but I love them all. I can't pinpoint a through line, an ethos, or even a vibe that defines what I want in a vampire film." And then Sarah goes on to list her top 10. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And you are absolutely right. This is something that I talked about in that conclusion segment earlier. It's something we've talked about throughout the podcast. But I think what I didn't anticipate was that this has been the most kind of disparate subgenre, even more so than the mind and body one, I would say, because vampire movies don't really have a kind of tone or look or vibe in common. They are just movies with vampires in them, right? So how can you compare a film like Nosferatu to a film like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Only Lovers Left Alive, or Blackula, or Ganja and Hess? These are so different. Some are romance, some are comedy, some are period dramas, some are horrors, some are teen movies, some are art house movies. It's a really difficult thing to compare one to another. So I agree with you. I found this particularly difficult to rank, but it means that what we've got are really fun and diverse top 10s. So with that in mind, and a big thank you one more time to all of you for your wonderful feedback. I'm sorry that I didn't have a chance to read everybody's emails, but I'm so grateful to everyone for writing in their wonderful emails and feedback. So thank you all so much for those emails, and thank you so much to all of you for sending in your top 10s. There were hundreds of you that sent in your top 10 lists. I have collated the results. Now, as ever, I've done a point system where your number 10 choice got 1 point, your number 1 choice got 10 points, and everything else is scaled in between accordingly. So I've mounted up the points for every single entry, and we have a definitive and brilliant top 10 list. So I'm going to continue reading some of your comments as we go through this top 10. So you guys voted for, at number 10, this is a real underrated gem in my opinion, and I'm so glad that so many of you voted for it. At number 10, it's George Romero's Martin.
My name is Martin. I'm 84 years old. People think I'm crazy when I tell them how old I am. I'd like to be normal. I just have a sickness. The only way I can survive is by drinking blood.
What a movie this is. I'm so glad that it got so much love from you guys. So listener Annika wrote in to say, "Hi Mike, thanks to your podcast, I sought this movie out and watched it for the first time. I'm not the biggest fan of traditional vampire films. I can't say I've ever really connected to any of the Dracula movies, but this film blew me away. I loved that it worked more as a psychological horror film, but with plenty of loving and knowing nods to classic vampire horror in its cinematography and production design. The character of Martin was troubling and disturbing, but somehow sympathetic, and I think it takes a director as smart and empathetic as George Romero to pull this off. I'm surprised this movie doesn't get hyped as much as his zombie films, as this is a true bleak little gem in the way Night of the Living Dead is. Here's hoping for a nice new physical release soon." Thank you, Annika, for that lovely review. And yes, I believe that we are going to get a second sight release of Martin very, very soon. In fact, I think you might be able to pre-order it already on Second Sight. So please do get yourself a lovely copy of the new upcoming physical release of Martin, especially if you've never seen this film, because it is absolutely brilliant. So that's your number 10 pick. That's George Romero's Martin. Up to number 9 now, and this is, of course, such a popular choice with horror fans and non-horror fans alike. At number 9, it's Neil Jordan's Interview with the Vampire.
From the novel by Anne Rice. From Neil Jordan, the director of The Crying Game.
I've come to answer your prayers. Life has no meaning anymore, does it?
His name is Lestat.
But what if I could give it back to you? Pluck out the pain and give you another life. One you could never imagine. I can see you lying on a bed of satin.
He chose one man. He gave him infinite power. Eternal life.
Love it. So this for me, never one of my personal favourites, but of course my guest on the podcast, Becky Dark, absolutely loved this one, and so many of you guys do absolutely love it. This comment came in from Matt. Matt said, "Interview with a Vampire creates a world I want to live in. I agree with all your critiques that the film feels somewhat sprawling, but for me personally, I could happily watch another 2 hours of this film and spend more time with these characters, these costumes, and that incredible incredible production design. As a teenager, unsure of his sexuality at the time, this film definitely stirred something in me. And I love that it's bold enough to be a big mainstream Hollywood film starring A-list actors that also works as a pretty on-the-nose gay love story. This film also features Tom Cruise's greatest performance. I wish he would stop jumping out of planes and go back to doing some proper acting, because he's really good at it. Thank you, Matt, for that comment. I love that. It's a good point, isn't it? I mean, I love Tom Cruise as well. I haven't watched any of the Mission Impossible films, and I've heard that they're excellent, and he does some amazing stunts and brilliant action work, but I kind of agree. I loved when he was doing kind of interesting, bold, weird stuff in the 90s and early 2000s. You know, this Interview with the Vampire, Collateral, Magnolia kind of stage of his career was some of my favourite work that he did. And he is a good actor, and he's definitely my favourite part in Interview with the Vampire. What I mentioned on our episode was that for me, the film just kind of slightly loses it in the second half when Tom Cruise disappears, sadly. But that first half of the film is just magic, and I'm so glad that so many of you guys love this one. So that's your number 9 in your top 10 vampire films. That's Interview with the Vampire. Okay, let's move up to number 8. We've got an equally sexy, queer, stylish vampire movie to discuss now. I'm actually kind of surprised this one was as high as it was, but there is so much love for this film. At number 8, it's Tony Scott's The Hunger.
Who's to keep you company when I'm gone? I'm sure you have thought about that. Who's it to be? Alice?
Stop it.
Look at me. Look at me! Miriam! What am I going to do?
Oh, what a good film. So stylish, so atmospheric, so fucking cool and sexy. This comment came in from Emily about The Hunger. Hi, Mike. I was so glad to hear The Hunger get some love and attention on the podcast, as I often feel like not enough people talk about this film or acknowledge it as a true classic of the horror genre. I've always been low-key obsessed with this film, from its sexy cinematography to its perfect soundtrack and its awesome makeup effects, not to mention David friggin' Bowie. Sure, it's a little style over substance, but when the style is this good, how can anyone resist? I would also agree with you and your guest that it works as the perfect segue between the art house erotic vampires of the 70s and the slick music video style vampires of the 80s. Thank you, Emily, for that comment. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that Axel and I discussed when talking about this film. This film came out in 1983 and kind of stands apart really from what came before and after it, but it does feel almost like this midway point. This is when vampires started to become cool and vampire films started to get those kind of music video aesthetics, but it still feels a little bit like one of those weird art house 70s vampire films at the same time. So good, and it's worth it just for these incredible performances and makeup effects alone. I love this movie. So glad that there's so much love from you guys on this movie. So that's your number 8. That's Tony Scott's The Hunger. Okay, let's move up to number 7, and this choice makes me very, very happy. I had a lot of feedback from people talking about how they discovered this film for the first time thanks to the podcast and fell completely in love with it. As did I. Your number 7 is Daughters of Darkness.
Well, it's difficult to forget. Ah, you will. After a while, it'll only be the remembrance of a bad dream, and then the remains of a remembrance, more and more faint in your mind. I have seen many a night fall away into an even more endless night.
Nights like last night.
Who do you think I am? A kind of ghoul? A vampire?
Who do you think I am? A kind of ghoul? A vampire? Absolutely love this film. Masterpiece, no notes from me, and I'm so glad that so many of you guys enjoyed it too. Your number 7 in your top 10. I was genuinely delighted to discover this. So this message came from David. He said, how can a film be so creepy, sexy and hilarious all at the same time? This movie made me so happy. Its unabashedly camp tone mixed with such dark and macabre subject matter makes it a film I now want to revisit on a yearly basis. Yes, this comment comes from Malcolm. Probably my favourite vampire film. So many smart choices. The location is perfect. The grand deserted Victorian hotel is far more interesting than a castle full of cobwebs. And I love how the look of the characters evoke people like Marlene Dietrich, implying that they have lived unnaturally long lives. Big thank you to all of you for your comments on this film. It's such a treat of a movie. One of my absolute favourite experiences this series was to watch this film and discuss it with Stacey Ponder. Such a funny discussion, such an interesting and wild little film. And if you haven't seen it yet, please go and check this film out, because everyone who I've recommended it to and have shown it to has fallen instantly in love with it. It's impossible not to love it. So that's your number 7. That is The Brilliant Daughters of Darkness. All right, moving up to number 6 then, and we've got another very cool 80s vampire classic. At number 6, it's Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark.
Caleb Colton no longer belongs to our world.
We'll give him a week, see if we can call him one of us.
He belongs to hers.
But you have to learn to kill.
He belongs to theirs.
I want to kill. He makes you kill tonight.
And they all belong to the night.
Love it. What a great film. It's such a favourite for so many of you guys. A lot of you actually had this right at the top of your list, so I know it means a lot to a lot of you. This comment came in from Anna. She said, for me, Near Dark is the coolest film in the coolest subgenre of horror. There's something about those visuals, that Tangerine Dream score, the dreamlike quality of the filmmaking, and those sexy and scary performances. I love its nods to classic westerns and the way it messes with genre, but when it wants to be truly horrific and scary, it excels. Bill Paxton's Severin is one of the scariest and coolest characters in the vampire subgenre. Love this. Yes, couldn't agree more, Anna. It has a bit of everything, Near Dark, doesn't it? I think it's such a cool film. It's so slick and stylish, but it has got some amazing characters and some brilliant set pieces, some truly frightening stuff in here as well. And it definitely seems to be a film that over the years, its influence seems to have grown and grown. You know, you can see more and more films these days that feel like they owe a debt to Near Dark. Rihanna and I were even discussing Dr. Sleep as feeling a bit near dark last week, and you can feel how much, even though the film didn't make a huge amount of money initially, how much it's grown in people's estimation over the years. And it's such a favourite for so many of you guys, so I'm so glad it's ranked so highly on your list. At your number 6, that's Catherine Bigelow's brilliant Near Dark. Okay, we're moving into your top 5 now, and they are all 100% bangers from this point onwards. At number 5, it's another 80s vampire movie. It's Fright Night.
Do you realize how much trouble you've caused me? Spying on me. Almost disturbing my sleep this afternoon. Telling policemen about me!
Absolute banger. This comment comes from Max. He said, "Hi Mike, thank you for covering the greatest vampire film ever made. This movie is everything I think vampire films should be. It's scary, sexy, brimming with queer undertones, and filled with great scares and fun set pieces. Chris Sarandon is, for my money, the sexiest vampire in cinema history, and Stephen Jeffries' portrayal of Evil Ed Thompson is somehow both one of the funniest and saddest characters in horror history." Thank you for that comment, Max. Yes, could not agree more. I loved rewatching this film for the podcast and discussing it with Jamie Graham. And I think what's so great about this film, even though it is kind of frothy fun on the surface, there's actually so much going on just beneath the surface. Max touched upon some of it there, you know, the quite sad character of Ed, or the kind of queer undertones running throughout. You know, there's a lot of kind of really interesting stuff to explore in this film, as with so much of the vampire subgenre. So this is such a perfect example of that. That is Tom Holland's brilliant Fright Night from 1985. All right, we're finally going to something a little bit older now. In fact, a lot older. At number 4, you guys voted for F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. think this might be one of the first ever times that a silent movie from the 1920s has made it into the listener's top 10, let alone top 5 for any subgenre. But I think it's testament to just how powerful this film is. I mean, my guest, James Swanton, actually called it the greatest silent horror movie ever made. I would agree with him. I think this film is absolutely incomparable. It still is so entertaining, so creepy, so beautiful to watch, and I'm so glad that so many of you guys agree with me, and it made it as high as number 4 on your list. This comment came from Sandra. Sandra says, I watched Nosferatu in a film class I took in high school, and I will never forget it. The haunting, otherworldly images felt like they were dredged from a nightmare. I think it's ironic that one of the least frightening subgenres of horror began with one of the most terrifying films ever made. To this day, no other vampire film has matched the creepy, icky, sickly vibes of Murnau's masterpiece. Thank you, Sandra. Could not agree more with that. It's true. You know, we've talked a lot about how the vampire subgenre doesn't really feel as frightening these days as many other subgenres, and yet it all started with this film, which remains one of the creepiest movies ever made, right? Almost mythic, and it's 100 years old this year. Absolutely astonishing. What a masterpiece. So that's your number 4 in your top 10 vampire movies. That's the brilliant Nosferatu. And as we move up to number 3, we go from one Dracula adaptation to another. At number 3, you guys have voted for Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
You really trust, excuse me, that I do not join you. But I have already dined, and I never drink wine.
Oh God, what a movie. This message came from Thomas. He said, there is simply no better Dracula adaptation. It felt like every adaptation before this one had led to this point. It took a mad genius like Francis Ford Coppola to assemble this cast, these filmmaking techniques, and adapt this book in the way he did. Everything is strange, deranged, scary, and sexy in the way that Bram Stoker's novel should be. It's the definitive adaptation of Dracula, and no other adaptations can exist beyond it. I love that, Thomas. It's perfectly put, because we've never had anything since this movie that has even come close, I think, to successfully adapting that original book. I would say that this is one of the best adaptations of the original novel, partly because it does take liberties, but because it's so cinematic, right? It's such a sumptuous visual feast with an amazing cast, with outrageously camp performances. It's fun, it's sexy, it's thrilling, it's creepy. It's everything that Dracula should be, I think. And I'm 100% with you guys. It's one of my all-time favourites. And that is, spoiler alert, the highest Dracula adaptation on your list. So there we go. The listener's favourite ever adaptation of Dracula is Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula from 1992. And that's your number 3 vampire movie. Okay, moving up to number 2 then, and it was close at the top 2. And this is a movie that, I've got to be honest, I thought was going to be your number 1, but it got pipped to the post. So, at number 2, it's Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys.
You'll never grow old, Michael, and you'll never die. Be one of us.
Notice anything unusual about Santa Carla yet?
It's a pretty cool place. If you're a Martian.
Or a vampire.
When I rewatched this film for the Vampire series, I was reminded of just how perfect this film is. Like, I always knew that it was fun and stylish and cool and had some awesome performances in it. But rewatching it, I was like, yeah, every element of this film works. It just comes together perfectly. And I'm not surprised that this film is as beloved as it is among horror fans. It's just so wonderful. So Rebecca said, growing up as an 80s kid, this felt like it was made for me. It's quite simply the coolest and sexiest vampire movie ever made. Josh wrote in to say, for me, vampire movies are all about style, and this is the most stylish of all horror films. Annika commented to say, Kiefer Sutherland manages to pull off that perfect balance of threatening and sexy, a film for the ages. And Mandy said, probably the horror film I've watched more than any other. It's in my top 5 movies of all time, and I know every iconic line off by heart. This film lives rent-free in my head. Thank you so much for all of those wonderful comments. And yes, I think so many people out there concur. I think it's such a personal favourite for so many people out there. Like I said, it's perfect. I think everything about this movie works. I love the soundtrack. I love the direction. I love the performances, the costumes. Everything about it is just so fucking cool. And for a movie that feels so 80s, it somehow also feels timeless. And I love that. And I think it's going to continue to find an audience the older it gets. So that's your number 2 vampire movie of all time. That's The Lost Boys. Before we get to the number 1 then, I'll quickly rattle off a few honourable mentions. These are films that just missed out on making it into your top 10. First of all, What We Do in the Shadows. That was your number 11 pick, so it didn't quite make it into the top 10, but so much love for that film. I mean, I'm assuming you guys are probably voting for the film, although love for the television series, I'm sure, probably influences that choice somewhat. Blade also scored very high, just missed out on the top 10. Only Lovers Left Alive, the brilliant Jim Jarmusch film. I know for a lot of you that was really high up in your top 10, as was Park Chan-wook's Thirst, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and Salem's Lot, Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot. It didn't quite make the top 10, but I know for so many of you guys that was something that traumatized you as a kid and you've never forgotten it. So yeah, those are just a few of the movies that didn't quite make it into the top 10. There were also lots of Dracula adaptations. Dracula, the 1958 Hammer version, came very close to being in the top 10, but it didn't quite scrape it. So, what did make it to your number 1? Well, you guys voted as your favourite vampire movie of all time, Thomas Alfredson's Let the Right One In.
Är du här igen? Är du här igen? Jag vill vara i fred. Jag vill också vara i fred. Gå hem då. Gå hem själv, jag har bott här längre än du.
What a masterpiece. Gareth said this film belongs in a different league to everything else covered this season, and it almost feels unfair to pit it against a film like Blackula or Martin, but it can't be denied that this film is perfect from beginning to end. Emily says a haunting and devastating tale of friendship and loneliness. Matt says, for a film that's so cold and barren, there is so much feeling and emotion that every time I watch it, my heart bursts. And Craig says, even in a world of monsters, nothing is more terrifying than a bully. While this film contains so many moments of tender humanity, it also features some of the scariest and most upsetting scenes committed to celluloid. And that final act in the swimming pool is nothing short of horror perfection. Couldn't agree more with all of those sentiments. What a perfect film. And it does tick all of the vampire boxes. It's beautiful to look at. It's moving. It's sad. It's angsty. It's emo. But it's also scary and creepy and a bit gross at times. And it's tender and it's romantic and it's sweet. It's got everything. It ticks all the boxes, and it is a film that is infinitely rewatchable. I love that, and I'm so glad you guys voted for it in your droves. So there you go. I'm going to list through the top 10 one more time. So here is the listeners' top 10 vampire movies. At number 10, you guys voted for George Romero's Martin. At number 9, it's Interview with the Vampire. Number 8, The Hunger. Number 7, Daughters of Darkness. Number 6, Near Dark. Number 5, Fright Night. Number 4, Nosferatu. Number 3, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Number 2, The Lost Boys. And number 1, Let the Right One In. What an incredible list. And this is the thing. As much as there are some naysayers about the vampire subgenre, when you look at that list of 10, you can't deny just what masterpieces all of those films are in their own way, and they're all so different to each other as well. That's what I loved so much about this particular season, was talking about films that were all so radically different in their tone and style and content. And I'm going to finish this episode and this season by revealing my top 10 vampire movies. And this will be very quick. I won't talk about them for long because you've heard me talk about all of these films at length over the last 27 weeks. So here's my top 10 vampire films. At number 10, I went with Park Chan-wook's Thirst, a movie I didn't like when I first watched it, and then rewatched it and absolutely fell in love with it. At number 9, I went with Bram Stoker's Dracula, just beautiful and deranged. Number 8, I went with Let's Scare Jessica to Death, a movie that didn't get a lot of love from you guys on your list, but I absolutely adore this film. At number 7, I've gone slightly left field, and I've gone with Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep. Not traditional vampire films, but I think one of the best twists on the vampire subgenre that we've seen in recent years. At number 6, I went with Martin, just a masterpiece. Number 5, The Lost Boys. Number 4, the brilliant Nosferatu, same as you guys. Number 3, I went with Guillermo del Toro's Kronos, because that film absolutely blew my mind watching it this series as well. I think it's absolutely perfect. It's moving, it's sweet, it's tender, it's gross. It's everything I want in a Guillermo del Toro vampire movie, and I loved it. And at number 2, I've gone with Daughters of Darkness, because again, for me, probably one of the most fun viewing experiences of the whole series. But at number 1, I couldn't argue with you guys. I feel the exact same way. It's Let the Right One In. It's a perfect film. It's literally perfect. It is in a different league to everything else on that list. A true bona fide masterpiece. So there we go. Both your favourite and my favourite vampire movie of all time, Thomas Alfredson's Let the Right One In. And that's it for this week, and that's it for this season. Thank you so much to everyone who listened and supported the podcast throughout this series. Thank you to all of you that emailed in with your top 10s and your feedback and your comments and your questions. Couldn't have done this series and this podcast without you. It's been such a fun journey, and we will be back in the spring of 2023 with a brand new season, and I will reveal a little bit of information about that season in just a moment. But first of all, let's do all the plugs. Don't forget that while we are off air, you can keep following us on all the socials. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd. You can join various different places to discuss the podcast or anything horror related with fellow listeners. You can join the Evolution of Horror Discord, or you can join the Facebook discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group. If you want to keep up to date with EOH events, because we've got loads of fun screenings and panel discussions and quiz nights and various other things that happen throughout the UK regularly, just head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events, and that's where we will keep updating the page every time we announce another screening or event. And I can tell you right now that we have got a Manchester screening happening on the 18th of February. The tickets haven't gone on sale yet, and I won't say what the film is, but I will say it's an absolute 80s masterpiece that has not yet been covered on the podcast. So if you are in or around Manchester, please do save that date and come along as soon as tickets go on sale. And one more plug for our Patreon channel, of course, because if you want to continue listening to weekly episodes, brand new content, then you can sign up to our Patreon channel on patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful, especially during our hiatus, if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as it really keeps this podcast on people's radars and it helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, well, all that's left to do is talk a little bit about next season. Now, I've announced this on the socials. A couple of my guests have kind of hinted about it here and there, but I can now confirm that our next season, which kicks off in the spring of 2023, is going to focus on home invasion. Well, kind of home invasion. A bit of a spin on home invasion. The next season is simply going to be called home, because we are going to be focusing on all horror movies set within a domestic space. Now, aliens and vampires that we've been discussing for these last 2 seasons have been really fun, but it's time to get dark and disturbing and scary again. So we are going to be discussing classic home invasion movies, everything from Last House on the Left to Funny Games to Hard Candy to The Strangers, You're Next, Hush, Gerald's Game and Mother. But we will also be talking about a range of other domestic set horror movies in which our main characters stumble across a house and bad things happen to them. For example, The Old Dark House, or Misery, or The People Under the Stairs. So a kind of home invasion and reverse home invasion. But not only that, we're also going to be looking at kind of psychological thrillers that take place in a domestic space, like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, or Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, or Gaslight. So there are so many films to discuss. There's going to be so much scope. Hopefully there's going to be a bit of something for everybody, but one thing's for certain, next series we're getting dark and gritty and scary again, and I for one cannot wait. So join us in the spring of 2023 for season 9, but in the meantime, let's put a stake through the heart of our vampire season and say goodbye. Thank you so much for listening. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and join us again soon for another episode and another season of the evolution of horror.